Greetings, my name is Kerry and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about every indie book I read in 2019. One of the challenges I set myself for 2019, and I'm actually doing it again in 2020, is the Indie Challenge, which is a year-long readathon hosted by Ninja Book Box to encourage people to read more books from independent publishers. They had a bingo card for last year and there's a new one for this year to help you track what different categories some of the books you're reading come into, what challenges they meet. So I'm doing that again this year, but I thought I'd just go through and talk about all the indie books I read last year, because this really encouraged me to seek out more books from independent publishers and to be more aware of what I was reading. So I'm going to go through the books. If I remember the publisher, I'm going to say what the publisher was, and then I'm going to say what categories they ticked off on the bingo card for me. I'm going to try and go through it quite quickly. So I actually read 35 books from independent publishers last year, which was about a third of all the books I read, just over a third. So the first book I read was called Tentacle by Rita, Indiana. I've actually unhauled this one. This was from a publisher called And Other Stories. This was a book that was out of my comfort zone, represented marginalised people, LGBTQIA+, an author from another country, a book that defies genre, a book from my TBR, and a translated book. And I used it in the end because I was trying to hit every category once at least, so I used this as an out of my comfort zone book. The second indie book that I read was The Outrun by Amy Liptrot. This is published by Canongate. This was an award winner, press over 20 years old, non-fiction, biography, book from my TBR, a debut, and recommended by a friend as it came in a Ninja Book Box, I believe. And I used this for a prize winner, an award winner. Next book that I read was On the Come Up by Angie Thomas. This was published by Walker Books, which specialises in books for children and young people. This was marginalised people, press over 20 years old, kids or YA, author from another country, and a favourite author, and I use this for marginalised people. The next indie book that I read, this is the hefty one, was The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. This is published by Bloomsbury Books. This was LGBTQIA+, press over 20 years old, and genre fiction as it's a fantasy book, and I use this for LGBTQIA+. The next book I read was Night Poems by Sulochana Manandhar. This is published by Tilted Axis Press. This was a poetry collection, author from another country, translated book, a new to me press, and a crowdfunded book. I actually supported the Kickstarter to get these little books published, and I used this for a poetry collection. Next we have The Chosen Ones by Scarlet Thomas. This was published by Canongate. This was a book from a series, kids or YA, genre fiction, book from my TBR, and recommended by a friend, because again this was recommended by Bex SL from Ninja Book Box, and I used this for book from a series. I should say, if I'm looking down, it's because my laptop's in front of me where I've got the spreadsheet where I tracked all of this. Next we have The House on Rosebank Lane, which is another book that I've unhauled. This one was out of your comfort zone because it's from a genre that I don't generally read. A press over 20 years old, genre fiction, and a new to me press. This was Black and White Publishing, I think it was called. So I used this for a press over 20 years old. Next we have The Strange and Beautiful Sorrows of Ava Lavender by Leslye Walton. This, I believe, was another Walker Books one. Pretty sure it was Walker Books. I borrowed this from the library, so I don't have a copy. And this was a press over 20 years old, kids or YA, and author from another country, so I used this one for kids or YA. Next I read Gemina by Amy Kaufman and Kristoff. This was published by Rock the Boat, which is an imprint of One World Publishing. This was book from a series, kids or YA, genre fiction, author from another country, and I use this for genre fiction. It's a YA science fiction series. Next we have Moon Fevers by Thuyēn. This is another one by Tilted Axis from the same series as Night. So this was a poetry collection, author from another country, translated book, and a crowdfunded book, and I used this for author from another country. Next we have The Christian Priest Today by Michael Ramsay. I've actually lent this to a friend, so I don't have my copy at the moment, and this was a press over 20 years old and non-fiction, and I used that to meet the non-fiction challenge. The next one I read was The Magician's Lie by Greer Macallister. This one was author from another country, a book that defies genre, a new to me press and a debut novel, and I used this for a book that defies genre. This was the first book when Ninja Book Club returned, and it's kind of historical fiction but also with a lot of fantasy elements thrown in. And The Magician's Lie was published by Legend Press. Next was How Not to Be a Boy by Robert Webb. This one was published by Canongate, and it was LGBTQIA+, a press over 20 years old, non-fiction, biography, and a debut. And I used this for biography. It was Robert Webb's memoir or / autobiography. The next one was An Interrupted Life by Etty Hillesum. This one was marginalised people, press over 20 years old, author from another country, non-fiction, biography, a women's press, so it's published by Persephone Books, which specialise in books by women, a new to me press, and an anthology because it's a collection of her writings, and I used this for a women's press. The next one I read was The Quiet at the End of the World by Lauren James. This is published again by Walker Books. This was for marginalised people because it features a deaf character, LGBTQIA+ because it features 2 bisexual characters and a trans character, a press over 20 years old, kids or YA, genre fiction, a favourite author, and that's the category I ended up using it for because I love Lauren James. The next book I read was called Imagine Church by Neil Hudson. This was, InterVarsity Press I think this was, I can't remember off the top of my head. I've lent my copy to a friend again so I don't have it at the moment. So this was a press over 20 years old, non-fiction, a book from my TBR, and a debut because it was his first book, and I used this to cover a book from my TBR. Next one was The Princess and the Cake by Linda Stift. This is published by Priory Press, and this was out of my comfort zone, an author from another country, and a translated book, so I used this for a translated book. The author is Austrian. The camera cut out and I don't know why, so what I was saying was this book features a lot of themes to do with mental health and eating disorders, so it was a very uncomfortable read at times, which was why it was out of my comfort zone as well. The next book I read was Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin. I can't remember what publisher this one was from. I read it as an ebook, which I borrowed from the library. This one actually was the first one that recapped categories that I'd already talked about. So this one was an author from another country, a book that defies genre, and a translated book, so I'd already found ones to hit all of these. So this was my first free square one essentially. The next one I read was Number One Chinese Restaurant by Lillian Lee. I've unhauled this one so I don't have it anymore. This also was author from another country, a new to me press, and a debut. I can't remember what the publisher was again off the top of my head, but I used it for a new to me press, so if I remember I'll put it on the bottom of the screen. The next book I picked up was The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon. This is another one published by Bloomsbury. This was a book from a series, a press over 20 years old, genre fiction because it's dystopian science fiction, a favourite author, and a debut because this was her first book, I believe, so I used this for debut. Next was The Mysterious Affair at Styles by Agatha Christie. So this edition is published by Dover Press, who specialise in reprints of old novels that they produce cheaply. So this was a book from a series, a press over 20 years old, genre fiction, and a favourite author. So again, this was another one that I didn't need it to meet any specific categories because I'd already covered those categories. The next one was The Wind That Lays Waste by Selva Almada. This is published by Charco Press. This covered author from another country, a translated book, a new to me press, and a debut. And again, I didn't need this to meet any specific categories. The next book that I picked up was called All Things Anglican by Marcus Throop. Again, this one I've lent to a friend and I can't remember the publisher off the top of my head. This was another non-fiction, a new to me press, and recommended by a friend. It was actually given to me by a friend, not only recommended by them, and so that is the category that I've used that one for. The next book was The Imitation of Christ, attributed to Thomas Kempis. This is published again by Dover Thrift Editions. This was a press over 20 years old, non-fiction, and a book from my TBR, and again I didn't need it to meet any specific category. Next we have Brightly Burning by Alexa Dunn. This is published by HMH, which stands for Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. So this one was for kids or YA, genre fiction, author from another country, a new to me press, a debut, and recommended by a friend, and again I didn't need it to meet any specific categories. The next one was Disturbing the Beast, which is an anthology published by Boudica Press. This one was a women's press, a new to me press, a debut, because it was the first book published by this publisher, established 2018, so the publisher was set up in 2018. This book was actually published in 2019, but the publisher themselves were founded in 2018. It's an anthology and a crowdfunded book. I again contributed to the Kickstarter to get this book published. The next one I read was The Stolen Kingdom by Bethany Attasada. This is a book from a series, genre fiction, author from another country, a women's press, technically, yeah. A new to me press, and a book from a micro press. So this is published by Grace House Press, which is Bethany Attasada's own publishing company that she set up to publish her own books. So that was why I picked that one up for this challenge, and that's the challenge I used this book to meet, was a book from a micro press, which is a press that has sort of only one person. And the next book that I read was Planetwise by Dave Booklets. This is published by InterVarsity Press, and this was a press over 20 years old, non-fiction, a debut, and recommended by a friend. And again, I didn't need this to meet any specific challenges. Then we have Please Read This Leaflet Carefully by Karen Havlin. This was published by Dead Ink Books, and I use this for marginalised people. So the main character in this suffers from endometriosis, which is a very little understood condition which a lot of women suffer from, so I class that as being marginalised. An author from another country, a new to me press, and a debut, and again I didn't need this to meet any specific challenges. Then we have Obsidio, also by Amy Kaufman and J. Kristoff, again published by Rock the Boat, an imprint of One World Publishing. This was, I thought it was LGBTQIA+, I can't remember why. Anyway, a book from a series, kids or YA, genre fiction, author from another country, and a book from my TBR. Again, I didn't need this to meet any specific categories. Then I read Those Who Wait by Tanya Marlowe. This was published by Malcolm Down Publishing, and this was non-fiction, a favourite author, and recommended by a friend. So this was actually a reread, and when I first bought it because a friend recommended it a couple of years ago. Again, I didn't need this to meet any specific challenge. Then we have On Anxiety, an anthology published by Three of Cups Press. This was marginalised people, LGBTQIA+, a new to me press, a debut. This was again the first book published by this publisher, recommended by a friend, established 2018 because again the publisher launched in 2018, an anthology and a crowdfunded book, and I use this for an anthology. Next I read Children of the Cave by Vir Samuel Corpy. This was published by Priory Press. This is an author from another country, a book that defies genre, a book from my TBR, and a translated book, and again I didn't need it to meet any specific challenge. Then I read Against Healing, which is a collection of poems translated from Korean by Emily Youngmin Yoon. This is a number of different Korean poets, again published by Tilted Access Press, and this was Out of My Comfort Zone, poetry collection, author from another country, or authors from another country, a translated book, an anthology because it's a collection of different poets, and a crowdfunded book, and I use this to meet the crowdfunded book challenge. And then finally, the final indie book I read was In the Name of Jesus by Henri Nouwen, and this was marginalised people because he talks about his experience of working with people with learning disabilities, author from another country, non-fiction, a favourite author, a book from my TBR, and a new to me press. So this was Darton, Longman and Todd are the publishers here. So that was every indie book I read in 2019 and all the challenges that met for me on the bingo card. And there's a new bingo card for this year which has a couple of slightly different categories, so I'm starting to work on reading some books for that for this year. Yeah, really enjoyable actually, challenging myself to read books from some different publishers, and indie publishers are often more representative of marginalised people groups and authors that are overlooked by the big five publishers. A lot of these publishers specialise in translating books that are popular in their own countries but haven't made it into English yet. So several of those presses, Priory Press particularly specialise in translating books from Europe, and I think Charco Press are a fairly new publisher that focus on books from South America, so another publisher that I want to check out more of their books. But yeah, so that was all the indie books I read in 2019. I'd love to know if you've read any of them and what you thought of them, or if you have any recommendations of other books from independent publishers that you think I should check out, so please let me know about that down in the comments. You can like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you haven't already, and also please do follow me on my social media. That information will always be listed in the description box below. But that's it for today, so thank you so much for watching and I will talk to you again soon. Bye!